The heavy spine of the manual hit the oak desk with a sharp, echoing crack. The HUD Secretary did not look up. He pressed his index finger hard against a single line of text in the International Energy Conservation Code. The paper crinkled under the force. He tracked that line across the page, his thumb tracing the exact phrasing that added $30,000 to the cost of every new home built in the country. It was a singular, rigid requirement, a mandate that acted as a brick wall. He looked up, his gaze fixing on the room of staffers, and stated that this specific line was the architect of the current crisis. It was a tax on the future, hidden in plain sight. With a swift motion, he pushed the manual aside, sliding it across the polished wood until it hit the edge of the table. The administration had decided they would no longer accept these federal mandates as inevitable. The war on the regulation began in that quiet office, framed by the weight of a single, expensive requirement. The era of the mandate was ending, and the push for a total overhaul was underway. 10 miles away, the sunlight hit the floor of a model home, illuminating a space that felt like a bridge to a different life. A young couple stood in the center of the living room. Their hands were shaking as they held a smartphone. One of them tapped the screen, entering the final loan amount into a mortgage calculator. The interest rate was locked at 5%. They hovered over the calculate button, then pressed it. The screen refreshed, displaying a monthly payment that was $400 higher than their current rent. The man stared at the number, then looked at the woman. She shook her head, pulling her hand away from the counter. The extra cost of the home, inflated by the very regulations now under fire, had pushed the dream out of reach. They stood in the quiet of the model kitchen, surrounded by new appliances and pristine walls, but the reality was absolute. The numbers on the screen were a firm barrier. They would not be moving in. They would be returning to their rental apartment, locked into a cycle they could not break. The silence in the room deepened as the weight of the math settled between them, a cold reminder of the crisis unfolding beyond these walls. Back at the federal office, the focus shifted from the individual to the machinery of government. The HUD Secretary stood before a podium, his movements precise and practiced. He did not speak of statistics. He spoke of the American dream as a hostage held by federal mandates. He declared a formal state of emergency regarding housing availability. The administration had decided that the International Energy Conservation Code was no longer a standard, but an obstacle. A staffer handed him a thick, red-stamped document. He signed the bottom of the page, the pen scratching audibly against the paper. The order was clear. The mandate was to be stripped away effective immediately. This was not a minor adjustment. It was a total removal of the requirements that had governed home construction for a decade. He closed the folder with a heavy thud, signaling the end of the debate. The directive rippled through the department, hitting desks and email servers within minutes. Down the hall, phones began to ring as the news reached the private sector. The barrier to entry had been dismantled by a single signature. The administration had fired its first shot, and the landscape of home construction was about to change. The news did not linger in the halls of government. It traveled fast, hitting the glass-walled boardrooms of the nation's largest developers by the hour. In one high-rise office, a dozen executives gathered around a polished mahogany table. A projector hummed, casting a map of the city onto the far wall. The image highlighted several blocks, marked in bold, designated as opportunity zones. One developer stood up, a pointer in his hand, tracing the perimeter of a site that had been stagnant for years. He tapped the screen. With the energy code mandates gone, the cost per unit dropped by $30,000. The room shifted. The hesitation that had defined the previous quarter evaporated. They pulled up spreadsheets, running the numbers again, this time without the overhead of high-efficiency insulation or specialized HVAC requirements. The math was sudden and aggressive. They finalized the plans, mapping out phases for thousands of new units. The strategy was set. Slash the red tape, compress the timelines, and flood the market. They were no longer waiting for permits or debating compliance. They were preparing for a build cycle that would redefine the landscape. The goal was volume, and the path was now wide open. The transition from boardroom strategy to physical action happened within 48 hours. Yellow machinery rolled onto the acreage that had been locked in legal battles for over a decade. Excavators bit into the dry, hard-packed earth, clearing away years of overgrowth and rusted fencing. A local zoning official arrived at the site, holding a stop work order, but he did not even reach the gate. A courier handed him a single, stamped document from the regional office, and the official folded it, retreating into his vehicle without a word. The barriers had dissolved. By sunrise the next day, the site was a hive of activity. Engines roared in a steady, rhythmic drone that echoed across the valley. Steel rebar was laid out in precise, geometric patterns, clicking against the gravel as workers tied the frames together. The concrete trucks arrived in a continuous line, their chutes swinging out to dump gray, heavy sludge into the waiting forms. Within 2 weeks, the foundations for the first 300 homes were set and occurring. The ground, which had been dormant for so long, was now hardening into a new, sprawling residential grid. There was no time for inspection delays or secondary reviews. The pace was relentless, turning the soil into a platform for growth before the week was out. While the foundation set, the descent grew louder. In a quiet conference hall, a lead analyst stood before a row of microphones, tapping a finger against a printed graph. He pointed to the projected thermal loss in the new, stripped-down frame designs. According to his data, the removal of the energy code was a temporary win. He projected that monthly heating and cooling bills for these new households would spike by 40% within the first year. A reporter in the front row asked if these costs would cancel out the $30,000 saved at closing. The analyst nodded, his expression tight as he laid out the math of long-term utility waste. Outside, the administration responded with swift, dismissive brevity. A spokesperson held a brief press event, standing before a stack of newly printed mortgage applications. They framed the energy concerns as theoretical obstacles designed to protect a status quo that kept families in rentals. They argued that the priority was the immediate ability to own a home, not the hypothetical efficiency of the walls. The debate sharpened, pitting the cold, hard reality of monthly utility bills against the immediate, tangible relief of a lower mortgage payment. The warning was clear, but it was being drowned out by the roar of the construction crews. The momentum did not stop at the state line. With the regulatory floodgates open, the administration pushed the streamlined approval process to regional offices across the country. In a single afternoon, a digital command cleared the backlog of thousands of pending applications. Project managers in a dozen different states received the notification and immediately signaled their crews to commence work. The effect was immediate. Across the heartland, dormant tracts of land were suddenly swarmed by heavy equipment. Dirt shifted under the weight of graders and bulldozers working in tandem. From the Midwest to the southern coast, the horizon began to fill with the skeletal frames of new residential blocks. There was no hesitation. the supply chain hummed with raw efficiency, delivering timber and materials to sites that had been empty just days prior. Families who had been priced out of the market watched as the houses rose in real time, their walls going up before the local zoning boards could even file a protest. This was an industrial-scale response to a nationwide shortage. The sheer volume of the build created a new physical footprint, turning once vacant fields into dense rows of housing. The speed was unprecedented, and the scale was absolute, as thousands of units moved from blueprints to reality in a matter of weeks. The HUD Secretary stepped out of a black sedan onto the gravel of the latest site. He walked toward a unit nearing completion. The structure stood as a raw skeleton of unfinished wood and exposed beams, lacking the layers of insulation and complex barriers required by the previous code. He stopped in the center of the living area, looking up at the rafters that would soon be hidden behind drywall. He reached out, running a palm over the bare timber. The silence of the construction site was punctuated by the distant sound of hammers. He pulled a heavy, permanent marker from a pocket and stepped toward a support stud near the doorway. With a deliberate motion, he pressed the tip against the wood and drew a thick, black line across the gray. It was a firm, uncompromising stroke. He stepped back, observing the mark, then tucked the pen away. The message was physical and absolute. The era of the old energy code had officially reached its conclusion at this site. He turned away from the wall and walked back toward the vehicle, leaving the mark as a permanent signature on the frame. The path was cleared, the standards were dismantled, and the new era of housing production was now defined by this single heavy stroke of ink. The ink on the stud was barely dry before the urgency spread. Across the region, the signal to accelerate was absolute. Builders shifted into a frantic, high-stakes sprint. Trucks loaded with raw lumber and supplies moved in a constant, grinding convoy between active sites. At the northern development, a sudden shortage of foundation concrete threatened to halt the pouring process. The lead foreman made a snap decision, diverting a shipment intended for a secondary project to keep the primary foundation moving. The trade-off was immediate. One side stalled while another accelerated. A chaotic balancing act repeated across every district. Workers moved with a relentless rhythm, hammering through the daylight hours and into the dusk. The air remained thick with the smell of sawdust and exhaust. Any pause in activity was treated as a loss of capital. Every hour counted as the pressure to meet the soaring demand increased. The market was no longer just responding. It was surging with a raw, unrefined energy. Foundations were leveled, frames were raised, and roofs were sealed in a blur of overlapping trades. The scramble reached a fever pitch, creating a landscape of half-finished structures and intense, focused labor. This was a race against time, with the builders pushing the limits of speed to satisfy the frantic momentum of the new housing surge. The keys turned in the locks for the first time. Families carried boxes across the thresholds of units that had not existed months prior. Inside, the spaces were bright, new, and finished with a basic utility. A father tested the thermostat, watching the heater cycle on instantly. His daughter ran a hand along the drywall, noting how quickly the room chilled as the exterior wind picked up. The insulation gaps were not visible, but the drafts in the corners told a quiet story of the missing requirements. They moved their furniture into place, filling the rooms with the weight of their belongings. There was no hesitation in their movements. The priority was the roof, the ownership, and the stability of a place to call their own. They signed the final closing documents, trading the promise of long-term efficiency for the immediate reality of a monthly mortgage payment. Outside, The neighborhood was a row of identical frames, all occupied in a sudden, synchronized wave. The administration's goal was achieved. The units were full. Yet, as the first winter season approached, the true cost of the shortcut remained a silent variable. The families stayed inside, sheltered and secure, while the long-term consequences of the policy shift waited to be written into the future utility bills of every home on the block.